Right, good. Thanks for joining us this evening, especially in this weather. It's very kind of you to come. So I'll talk 45 minutes. I'll try not to bore you too much. Go to the questions as quickly as possible. I love the question that kind of is binding all of these lectures together. Is the future cancelled? And it's a really, I think, instinctively important question. I would say it is cancelled. It's been cancelled for quite some time. It's getting more cancelled over time. It's getting very cancelled, especially after last December. So why do I say that? How does that fit into the prospectus I offer in my book for the automated luxury communism? Well, I start the book by saying ours is an era of crisis. Everybody agrees with this. To say that is a cliche. Financial Times will say it, Economist will say it, Le Monde Diplomatique will say it, Donald Trump would say it, Narendra Modi would say it. It's a cliche. But it also has meaning. And it's a panoply of crises, which I call in the book a great disorder. We're going to live over the next 30, 40, 50 years a period of immense political, economic and technological turbulence. Imagine lapping over one another the First World War, the arrival of the printing press, and maybe the first ice age. It's quite a big shift underway. So, the leading edge of that was the 2008 financial crisis, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the nationalisation of AIG. A very momentous moment in US politics. If you go onto YouTube and you put in Kanjorski, Congressman Paul Kanjorski, he was interviewed on C-SPAN, and he said that had the United States not taken a certain sequence of actions in 2008, it would have been, quote, the end of our political and economic system as we know it. This wasn't some crackpot on democracy now. It was a US congressman on C-SPAN on a Sunday morning responding to a woman who said, why are working people not being bailed out when you can give all the money to the banks? He was very right. What's happened in that 12-year interregnum, since we had the global financial crisis 2008? I'm actually going to stand up because I need some energy for time. What's happened since 2008? We've had 12 years. In the UK, we've seen wages fall in real terms, which means they're including inflation, the cost of living, etc. They've fallen by about 10.4% between 2007 and 2015. Even today, they're very much below the levels we saw in 2008. Productivity, over the last 10 years, hasn't moved. What's productivity? It's the amount of output per person per hour worked. So the average hour of work today isn't creating any more than it was 10 years ago. Then you've got GDP per capita. Everybody loves to talk about GDP, particularly in the establishment media, because it's the figure that looks okay. But the point with GDP is that it's everybody working in the labour market. What's GDP? Gross domestic product. It's all the goods and services being made, being purchased, being consumed in 12 months within a particular geographical territory. But of course, if you've got more people, entering the labour market, if you've got large rates of immigration, high rates of immigration, that kind of distorts the figures somewhat. And actually, if you look at UK GDP per capita, that's GDP divided by all the people working, it's actually stayed still for the last 10 years. And when you measure it in dollars, it's about $10,000 lower than it was in 2007. Huge. If you look actually at the economies of the Republic of Ireland and the UK since 2007-8, you see this incredible decoupling. One is, of course, because the UK economy has just been smashed compared to Ireland, but also because of changes in the pound to the euro. And so today, the Republic of Ireland, its GDP per capita, all the economic wealth it's producing per person in a year is almost twice that of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. If you'd said that to a Brit in the 1950s, the 1960s, they would have laughed at you. Even in 2007-8, it didn't really seem plausible. So that's a testament to how much Britain is facing economic inertia. This isn't just Britain though. It's also the United States. In the US, you saw food stamps, which is probably the best indicator of absolute poverty, federal assistance to access food. Before the 2007 crisis, it was around 26, 27 million people in the US, population more than 300 million, required food stamps to eat. After 2008, that rises, it almost doubles. It goes to 47 million, which really, I think, sort of speaks to the strength of the crisis after 2007-8. And for all the talk of fake news on the campaign trail in 2016, Donald Trump repeated a number saying we have 40 million people on food stamps in this country. Barack Obama says he's doing a great job, And yet, we've got more than 13 million more people on food stamps now than before he became president in 2007. So he can't be doing that great a job. Similarly here, the analogue to food stamps is of course food banks. We think more than 2 million people have used food banks since 2010. So, GDP per capita, stagnant or going backwards. Wages going backwards, productivity stagnant. What else have we got? Home ownership. UK rates of home ownership are their lowest level since 1986. I'm not saying that, that's the Financial Times. Life expectancy. The average working class man today in Glasgow or Sheffield can expect to live to 65. Yes, as I'll talk about later on, we're seeing many people live longer. A larger cluster of the population called the oldest old. But actually working people in Western Europe and North America in the last couple of years have seen their life expectancy fall. It's going backwards. So home ownership, life expectancy, wages, productivity, GDP per capita. This isn't working. You'd have to be completely insane to think this is a functioning economy. And yet the Tories just won a majority in 80 in December. We'll talk about why. Because they're offering the second part of this talk, luxury communism versus what I call scarcity nativism. They're offering very much the latter. The problem is that economic crisis, which isn't working for anybody. You're seeing rising inequality, you're seeing massively increased absolute poverty. 4 million kids in this country right now are living in poverty. That's 60% or less. What's poverty, by the way? Relative poverty. They've still got an iPhone, how can they be poor? Let's talk about that. Relative poverty is 60% or less of the median household wage. Now the median household wage in this country is around, depends who you ask, it's the high 20,000, right? So 60% or less of that. Now try and live on that in Manchester or London. And actually, rates of child poverty tend to be highest in these places. So if you include housing costs, in Newham, more than 50% of children live in relative poverty. Some of the highest rates in the country. So I think Hackney, Newham, a couple of other London boroughs, Tower Hamlets is above 40%. Very, very high. In Manchester it's 35%, Luton 35%, Blackburn 35%. Now, 1 in 3 kids in these places is in poverty. You can walk around Manchester, 1 in 3 kids will be in poverty. This is clearly a deeply dysfunctional system. By 2022, that figure of 4 million kids in poverty is going to rise to 5 million. These are projections based on today. They could be right, they could err one way or the other. It could be better, it could be worse. I suspect it would be worse. Boris Johnson may surprise to a big Keynesian stimulus. I still don't think I'll make much of a knock on child poverty personally. So, child poverty, looking as bad as all these other measures. The big problem is that economic malaise we all live in, and I feel terribly sorry for young people in this context, by the way. I graduated from university the year that Lehman collapsed. I thought it was funny at the time. You know, I thought it was great. You had the G20 meltdown the following year, people smashing up the City of London. I thought, very cool. Little did I know it would, have a massive impact on my life prospects for the next 10 years. And people who expected to go into decent professional jobs, unionised jobs in the public sector, whatever, for 5 or 6 or 7 years, were living in very precarious jobs. Still are some of them. I look at some people who work in bars or restaurants, and I think, how different would your life have been in their mid-30s? How different would your life have been had that crisis not happened? Would you be in legal services? Would you be in the city? God knows. I think it really hit home when I was working in a bar in 2009, and I met a former interest rates trader. I didn't even know what that was. I still don't know what that is. But it was interesting to be working in a bar alongside somebody who traded interest rates. I have no idea. So if we think about that market, it's terrible. But the thing is, it's the leading edge of a much bigger problem, this great disorder. So that economic problem we've got, the UK, the US, not just those countries, Central European countries, basically seen stagnation for 10 years. Brazil, seen pretty low rates of economic growth since the crisis. Russia, China and India had 10% trend growth before 2007. They're now hitting 6%, there or thereabouts. So you're seeing a secular is to say, it's not cyclical, a secular slowing down of growth. This has been called secular stagnation by none other than Larry Summers, a very esteemed US economist. This is just one problem amongst many. What are the other ones? One is climate change. We're going to see significant climate warming over the next several decades. if anybody ever says to you climate change doesn't exist, it does. The planet today is about 1 degree warmer than it was in the 1860s. It would be warmer still had we not put so many aerosols into the upper layer of the atmosphere. That's actually cooling us, believe it or not. So it should be significantly warmer. It will get warmer still. If you think about all the people in the course of the 20th century responsible for large numbers of people dying, I think the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch, for peddling climate denial, whether it's in think tanks or in the media, will be responsible for millions of people's deaths. It's an interesting sort of philosophical question to ask, will they be held responsible by future generations? I hope they are. What does climate warming look like in both the short and the long term? In the short term, by 2050, the UN expects 200 million climate refugees. We're looking at this century. Of course, climate change, the politics around climate change are very difficult. Why? Because the Earth is 5 billion years old. And so the margin of error in judging weather systems and hydrological systems and climate warming isn't that easy. You could have warming of 4 or 5 degrees in the next 100 years or the next 1,000 years. It's almost certainly in the next 100 or 200 years. But there is a big margin of error when you're dealing with something like a planet, a 5 billion year old planet. However, most reasonable experts now predict 2 degrees warming this century. If it goes beyond that, we start to get what's called runaway climate change. There's a big debate about what that looks like, its complexion, how quickly it unfolds. One sort of analysis presented by a gentleman called Mark Linus is that once we go beyond 2 degrees, we go to 3, and at 3 degrees the Amazon basin disappears. The Amazon basin becomes a desert. Of course, that takes in 20% of global CO2. That pushes us to 4 degrees. At 4 degrees, we get large amounts of permafrost melting in Siberia. You've probably seen on YouTube these bubbles in Siberia. All the permafrost melts. The methane presently underground, frozen, goes into the atmosphere. Methane is incredibly potent as a greenhouse gas, far more so than CO2. That takes us to 5 degrees. At 5 degrees, what's called methane hydrate starts being discharged from the ocean beds. Makes the ocean so acidic nothing can live in them except jellyfish. But that pushes us to 6 degrees and so on and so forth. Now, all of these events are being modelled on stuff that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. It may not happen in that sequence. It may be much worse. It could be better, it probably won't be. But we can look at 6 degrees warming as a perfectly plausible scenario if we go beyond 2. Which is why there's such a political impetus around capping warming at 2 degrees C. So what would a world of 6 degrees warming look like? Well, actually we can look back at when the world was 6 degrees warmer than it is today. Most of the planet would be submerged by water. The bits that aren't would be desert. Desert would go as high as Lisbon in Portugal. But that wouldn't be the worst thing. The fact that we could only just about sustain large-scale agriculture in the North and South Pole, and if you look at a map, you realise it's not much of the South Pole. With a 6 degrees warming scenario, the bits of the planet which would stay above water are Tasmania, the Western Antarctic, and bits of Patagonia. It's a planet of 10 billion people, where do they go? Interesting question. That wouldn't be the worst news. In a world of 6 degrees warming, there'd be such high concentrations of CO2 and particularly methane in the atmosphere that anything with lungs would struggle to breathe. So, let's park that. Let's say that's in the distant future, maybe your great-grandchildren. That's their problem, not ours. That's how previous generations seem to have dealt with it. Why should we be any different? In the shorter term, you're still presented with major problems this century. 3 degrees warming, I've already talked about at 2. You have 200 million climate refugees. At 3 degrees, the glaciers which provide fresh drinking water to India, to China, to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, they disappear at 3 degrees. Some of the largest, most important rivers in the world, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, these will disappear because they come from glaciers. The disappearance of glaciers is a huge challenge in terms of water security. Again, a secular challenge. It's difficult to see how you come back from that. So climate change has implications in our lifetimes and also in the distant future. And when I spoke to David Wallace Wells, who wrote a fantastic book called The Uninhabitable Earth, I think it was one of the best books of last year, he said you shouldn't look at climate change as a political problem to be put alongside the global south, or feminism, or race studies, or anti-austerity activism. Climate change should be viewed as the bookshelf, and you're putting all of these in the bookshelf. So whatever you care about, whatever area of policy, or you guys here are maybe ethicists, or I don't know your backgrounds, climate change, I'm sure almost all of you are aware, has massive repercussions. So, economic crisis, which is probably slower but as intense as the one we saw in the late 1920s. Climate change, to an extent we've not really known since we were around. The concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, by the way, today, concentrations of CO2 are higher than they've ever been in the history of any primate ever. That's not higher than a couple of hundred years ago, not higher than, the arrival of Homo sapiens, any primate. Quite a significant problem, one would imagine. And by the way, the concentrations of CO2 are what create the higher warming, which create the rising sea level, etc., etc. That's before we go into declining crop yields. That's before we go into a panoply of other problems. Let's park climate change, pressing. Third one, demographic ageing. And actually in the short term, this is probably worse than climate change. It's alongside the problem of the economic model, demographic ageing. In 1900, the leading causes of death were infection, pneumonia. I think the three leading causes of death are pneumonia, influenza, and maybe something else. Obviously, with the arrival of antibiotics, that disappeared. Today, the leading causes of death are age-related. Cancer, heart disease, stroke. In this country, believe it or not, is Alzheimer's, is the leading cause of death. Quite a new thing. But what that tells us is that actually living longer and longer creates new healthcare needs. That's a cliche as well, but it's also true. This presents problems for policymakers because even if, because of that first thing we talked about, economic kind of permanent stagnation, there's a significant minority at least of people who live longer and longer. And they will have ever more expensive healthcare challenges. And so we talk about, with technology, we talk about how things can just speed up in a sort of mesmeric fashion. This will also happen with healthcare problems. So you're twice as likely at 75 than at 70 to have a heart attack, twice as likely again at 80, twice as likely again at 85. Of course, people don't just get heart attacks, they also get strokes, they also get cancer, they also get Alzheimer's. So imagine how much the state will have to pay on somebody who lives to 100 who suffered, all four. It's hugely expensive to care for an aging population of that, to that extent. And so the oldest old will take up an ever larger portion of national wealth. This shouldn't be a problem, by the way. Of course, for the right, and right now their common sense prevails, they would say, this means we can't afford the NHS. But in fact, when you think that the United States spends around twice as much as we do on healthcare, UK spends around 9% of its GDP on healthcare, the US spends twice as much, we have universal coverage, we have longer life expectancy, we have lower infant mortality rates. I would suggest we've probably got a better healthcare system, and yet we're spending significantly less. You would say it's not a question of we can't afford to have an NHS-style system for elderly care, and we can't afford not to, right? Which is why we need to campaign for a national care service, given the challenges of demographic ageing. Here's a really remarkable statistic. You're more likely to die as a woman in childbirth in the United States than you are in Bosnia. A country with its, you're looking at GDP per head in Bosnia, I don't know, $5,000? In the US, what is it, $60,000? So when people try and present that as a really good measure of what a country is achieving, not so great if you're dying in childbirth in the US, people say, with this really advanced developed country. So those are three challenges amongst others. I talk about automation in the book as well, which I think pose secular challenges to market capitalism. The economic crisis, the sort of climate crisis, and demographic ageing. Another one is automation, which presents massive, massive problems. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there's a great anecdote, and it expresses it very well, because it's not a new problem actually. In the early 1950s, Walter Reuter, who was a trade unionist with US automotive workers, he's being shown around a new factory by Henry Ford III, who was the grandson of Henry Ford. And Henry Ford III turns to Reuter. He points to some of the very first industrial robots on any factory floor in America to make automobiles, and he says, how are you going to get these robots to pay your union dues? Walter Reuter turns back and says, how are you going to get them to buy your cars? Which is to say that capitalists have always wanted affluent consumers and cheap workers. And there's a contradiction there. Keynes talks about it, all sorts of economists have talked about it, quite vanilla bourgeois economists have talked about it, and it's called, some people call it underconsumption, some people call it the crisis to wage capital relation, but you have an economic system, aka capitalism, which becomes more and more productive, can make more and more with less and less human labour, and yet simultaneously it's excluding human labour from the process. How's the only way we can access these goods and services made more efficiently than ever before? Through wages. Which is why right now Silicon Valley is obsessed with the UBI. Again, talk about the merits of that perhaps in the questions, I'm not such a fan. Automation joins those other ones. In the short term, automation isn't something that really affects us. People talk about automation as something that's going to be an affliction of the most advanced economies. That's not necessarily true. It's actually a major issue for the global south. Why? In the 1970s, when workers' wages were too high in North America and Western Europe, where did the companies making automobiles go? So if you wanted to think of a car manufacturing plant in the 70s, you'd think of Turin in Italy, you'd think of Medfia, you'd think of Dagenham, you'd think of Detroit. Today, you still have some car factories in the global north, but most of them have moved elsewhere. Why was that? Because automotive workers were incredibly militant, they were very well organised, you had high rates of industrial action, the rate of return falls, capitalists want a high rate of return, that's why you're a capitalist, so they do something which Marxists call the spatial fix, they relocate elsewhere. Now, wages in China have been going up for 20 years too, but the problem is, there's nowhere else really, to go. I think it was Morgan Stanley said no next China. But actually they don't even need to do that. Because China today is the #1 importer globally of global robotics. And so rather than the sort of the comprador bourgeoisie, the Chinese industrial capitalist class saying rates of return are too low here because of our workers, which they increasingly are, rather than saying, okay, well let's move to Nigeria, to Pakistan, to Indonesia, which they could. Some areas are doing that. What's instead happening is automation, the technological fix rather than the geographical one. Now in some sectors, like in textiles, garment manufacture, you have very high levels of what's called motor sensory coordination, very difficult to automate. That won't happen. But in things like steel manufacture, in things like automotive manufacture, electronics manufacture, you'll see the technological fix rather than the geographical one. Now, what does that mean? Look at Nigeria. Nigeria should be the China of the 2050s, the 2060s. You should see this virtuous cycle that bourgeois economists would like to talk about. They say, well, wages will be too high there, they'll have to relocate to Nigeria, and magically they'll have all the roads and the schools and the hospitals, and the mixed market economy once again will deliver the goods. Well, no, that didn't happen in China anyway. Forget about that for a second. That won't happen because Chinese capital won't be relocating to Nigeria for the reasons I've just said. Nigeria, by the late 21st century, is going to have a population bigger than the United States, maybe 400 million plus. The 3 biggest cities on earth by the end of this century won't be in Europe, won't be in America, won't be in South Asia, won't be in East Asia, they'll all be in Africa. Places like Dar es Salaam, Kinshasa, Nairobi. These will be the biggest cities on earth, right? But foreign direct investment's not going there. You've got less fresh water, you've got declining crop yields. So what kinds of jobs do these people do? If the sort of global multinationals aren't relocating there for decent rates of return, if you have maybe 60% less food available, and at the same time, by the way, your population is rocketing, Africa's population is set to double by 2050, maybe quadruple by 2100. People don't think about this. Tanzania could have about 200 million people by 2050. Tanzania, who's heard of Tanzania? That sounds kind of racist, I don't mean to say it like that, but that's a huge population, right? That's three times the population of France. It's a lot of people. And yet they're going to be locked out from what are called global commodity chains, because increasingly many of these are being automated. There's an increasingly minimal part of human labour. So technological change, automation, actually is a huge issue as well for the global south. Then finally, the final aspect of automation, machine learning, deep learning. So if you think that there's been a huge concentration of wealth, which there has been over the last 40 years, you ain't seen nothing yet. 50% of venture capital in the US goes to just California. Why? That's because that's where all the big digital companies are. 50%. That will get worse over time. Why?
because machine learning, deep learning will be applied to ever more sectors of the economy. One projection says that there'll be $13 trillion added to the global economy by machine learning by 2030. This is in a great book called AI Superpowers, written by the gentleman who oversaw the introduction of Google to China. It didn't go well. However, the book did. It was very well received. $13 trillion is added to the global economy because of machine learning. 70% of that goes to China and the US. So the global south, but Europe as well actually when it comes to AI, isn't even at the horses, isn't at the races. So you're looking at a level of underdevelopment, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, which is analogous to the arrival of the steam engine. Just a different world in sub-Saharan Africa to what you're going to see in parts of the US and parts of China. And that concentration of wealth will also, of course, be accompanied by regional inequality. All that cash, all that information, all the best quote-unquote human capital continues to go to California, continues to go to Southeast China. And so you see huge regional inequality as well as income inequality as well as global inequality. All because of what's happening around machine and deep learning. So this sounds like a pretty dystopian world, doesn't it? Why do I talk about luxury communism, fully automated luxury communism? Because of all that. Because I say simultaneous with these crises, this great disorder, is I think we're seeing the emergence of potentially what Marx would call a new mode of production. Mode of production. So mode of production doesn't just mean new technologies, it means new forms of social consciousness, new daily habits, new mental perceptions, new ways of relating to nature. And these all come together to create a mode of production, like feudalism, like capitalism, which of course has many mental assumptions, a certain idea of what nature is, etc. And I think we're on the cusp of a new mode of production, potentially new mode of production, which is communism, which is going to be very funny to some people. But how does that come from, given all the terrible things you've just been talking about? What I want you to start with, if you disagree with that notion, which you probably do, justifiably, is to accept, or at least I hope you accept, that capitalism itself is a socially contingent economic and social system. Has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. Hate to break it to you, capitalism won't exist forever. No. It may be the sort of the heat death of the planet in a couple of billion years' time, or it'll probably be sooner than that, because of the crisis I've talked about, but it is a contingent social system. Feudalism was a contingent social system. Had a beginning, had a middle, had an end. Had certain social features which made it what it was. Why is capitalism capitalism? I would say there's two fundamental features. To live, you have to sell your labour for a wage. That's quite new, believe it or not. And things are made for profit, for exchange value. Under feudalism, that's not the case. You're not working for a wage, and not everything is made, not everything is subordinated to the logic of exchange value. Quite different. Communism, if it was to be separate to capitalism, would have to attenuate those two core features, wouldn't it? You'd have to attenuate or negate the idea of having to sell your labour for a wage. You'd have to attenuate the idea that everything is subjected to the logic of exchange value profit. Right. Why am I saying communism, not socialism? They're two separate things, which is very important. Socialism doesn't represent a new mode of production, but rather a change in the relationship to the means of production. These are two different things, right? So we could have had socialism in the 1920s. There's an alternate reality where the German Revolution does splendidly well. Rosa Luxemburg doesn't die. That was always unlikely, actually, just because the balance of forces. But let's just say, it does well. She isn't killed by the Freikorps. They inherit, the Germans, socialists inherit the world's most technologically advanced society. Fantastic, just as Marx foresaw, right? Fantastic. You could have instituted socialism in that place. You could have done that. You could have done it in 1970s Britain. You could have done it in 2019 with Jeremy Corbyn. It would have been socialism, but it would have been a very strong social democracy. That's not communism, because the fundamental features within socialism are still there that you would get in a capitalist society. You have to sell your labour for a wage, you still have scarcity, and you still have significant production for profit. In some socialist societies you wouldn't have production for profit, you would still have scarcity. And Marx says in Capital Volume 3, this is one of the ways he delimits socialism from communism, he says that communism is the entrance into what he calls the realm of freedom from the realm of necessity, i.e. scarcity, or what John Maynard Keynes called the economic problem. We'll talk about that more in a second. So socialism and communism are quite different. Also Marx says with the arrival of communism, there'll be the end of any distinction between work and play. Sounds kind of weird. That's what he said. Right? He says there'll be the end of any distinction between manual and cognitive work, whereas socialism can have all of these things. So they're quite different things. But like I said, if you look at the technologies emerging out of what I call the third disruption, I'm sorry for the words I use, but I'm trying to appeal to a Silicon Valley audience with these as well as the luminaries of Brighton, who are inherently left-wing. The second you sort of smell the sea air, you become more left-wing. That's fine. I'm down with that. I wish I could, I wish I could live here. It's not criticism. The third disruption is creating a new technological basis for different kind of society where we could attenuate having to work for a wage, where we could attenuate any distinction between cognitive and physical labour, arguably where we could attenuate any distinction between work and play. Right? And the middle of the book looks at how it's already here. How it's already here with regards to artificial intelligence and work and robotics, how it's already here in relation to synthetic biology and food, and also healthcare, how it's already here with regards to renewables, and actually we can have a very optimistic future beyond hydrocarbons, just not within the market mechanism, but the potential is there. And so I'm basically saying we can move beyond this nexus of the wage relation, of fossil fuels, the factory system, production for profit, which has really prevailed for the last 250 years. We could move beyond that. The basis for that is there, alongside all this crap. Too much to go over about why I'm optimistic about that, why I think the signs are good. It's in the book. And if you can't afford the book, I'm sure you can pirate it. I personally prefer to read actual paper books. So this could be quite an interesting place to live. So I'll just go over a few sort of key areas where I think we're seeing a contradiction between the old world and the new. One is in relation to something called CRISPR-Cas9. Hands up who's heard of CRISPR-Cas9? That's a good audience. I was speaking at the European Commission, nobody's heard of it. CRISPR-Cas9 is it's a technique for gene editing. It's a really fascinating way of doing it. Believe it or not, bacteria have immune systems. They have an immune response when they're attacked by viruses. They effectively replicate some of the information they're being attacked with and they put it into their own genome. It's almost like nature's cut, copy and paste. Very interesting. Anyway, in the last couple of years, people have determined how you can replicate this process, how you could effectively cut, copy and paste genetic information for any organism. This isn't wacky. This isn't speculative. This already happens. In the United States today, school kids can do experiments where they'll change the genome of a bacteria so it glows in the dark. 30 years ago, this won you Nobel Prizes. Today, it's just kind of like what you do on a Thursday afternoon. Now, 2017, a gentleman called David Ishii in Mississippi. He's a dog breeder. He breeds Dalmatians. And he's also a biohacker. Strange people. And he writes to the FDA and he says, I want to edit my... No, this is getting wacky, I'm sorry. This is all happening, by the way, I'm not making this up. I want to edit the genome of my Dalmatians because they all get gout. Apparently all Dalmatians get gout. They have I find it remarkable. You look at a wolf, which is obviously what most canines have bred from over the last 12,000 years, and you look at a pug or a French bulldog. How the hell did we do that? It's a real credit to genetic inheritance. He says they get gout. I want to be able to resolve it. I've determined as a biohacker, it's really just one single nucleotide, a single letter, which is what we all are. Obviously, we're not composed just of DNA, but those are the instructions. A single nucleotide would account for whether or not a Dalmatian has gout. Right to the FDA says we can get rid of this. We've bred these animals in such a way as to give them these features. I want to breed those features out just a far more scientific and accelerated way. I'm not doing something we've not already done. I just know what I'm doing with regards to genetic inheritance. Right to the FDA. This is in 2017. Doesn't hear back for 3 weeks. He's kind of getting worried. And then there's a press release from the FDA, and they say we're going to treat edited genomes, which have been subject to CRISPR-Cas9, the exact same way we treat patented pharmaceutical drugs. Which is really intriguing, because all of a sudden, you're looking at technology which should be able to basically get rid of thousands of single nucleotide conditions very easily, in a manner we got rid of smallpox in the 1970s. as a species, as a civilization, that could all of a sudden be done to thousands of conditions, but it's actually going to be treated as a patented pharmaceutical drug. And that's a classic example of capitalism, imposing a logic of scarcity because of market rationality onto potential abundance. The myth is capitalism creates abundance. But in fact, what increasingly looks to be the case is capitalism gets the abundance which is possible because of almost limitless human ingenuity and has to rationalise it, has to render it scarce. Because otherwise, how do you make a profit? Now, I don't know who here has met anybody who has cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Huntington's, a disposition to flu. These are all the result of a single nucleotide. So there are 4 different nucleotides in DNA. Just as in binary information you get zeros and ones, and all digital information is a configuration of zeros and ones. Everybody in this room is a configuration of these 4 nucleotides in unbelievably complicated sequences. Obviously we've got other stuff as well, water, proteins, etc., but that's the information. As a civilization, we can change that information in advantageous ways, and actually, well, it's already starting to happen. But the point is, it's not happening because we say, well, as a society, we've agreed democratically to eliminate these conditions. What's happening is in China, we now know that 3 children have been born basically using CRISPR-Cas9 technologies, and they're healthy. So we as a society have 2 options here. The luxury communist option of democratically deployed socialised healthcare using this technology, or the scarcity nativist option, where these technologies are only available to the very wealthy. They've dreamed about being different biologically to the rest of us for thousands of years, to the extent we even, I'm sure you're familiar with the term, blue blood. And this actually would permit them to finally realise a millennia-long dream. They can map biological inequality onto economic inequality. It's true. They've wanted to do it forever. They believed it for long enough. And this technology allows them to do that. So people say, well, this technology sounds appalling. It's like any technology. It's unfolding within a particular political and economic and social context. And it's about how we choose to deploy it and in whose interests. And I'll give you a good analogy of how to understand that. How much longer have I got left? Wrap it up. Oh, almost 10 minutes.
All right. Yeah, got 7.5.
Okay. Who here's seen Elysium with Matt Damon? Very good film. Oh, go on, hands up. So I have a rough idea. It's a very good film. For people who haven't seen it, it's set in 21st century California, Los Angeles. Matt Damon plays a guy who has a job. It's the only part of the story which doesn't make sense. He has a job because everything's highly automated, whatever. You wouldn't need wage labour anymore, which creates its own problems, as we've already discussed, of underconsumption, or the incentives to produce if people can't consume the goods and services being produced, or whatever. You have California, you have this hellhole, you have this huge ghetto, effectively, in Los Angeles, and you have this off-world space colony called Elysium, which is where the global 1% live. Everybody's gorgeous, they all look fantastic, well rested, everybody on Earth looks awful, terrible, diseased. Matt Damon has a workplace accident, and he is subject to radiation poisoning. He goes to his foreman, and he says, I've just been irradiated, I'm going to die, what do I do? The foreman gives him some iodine tablets, he says, take these. He says, what's going to happen? You're going to die in 3 days. And Matt Damon obviously doesn't want to die. He's kind of mixed up in some quasi-criminal network, and they say, well, we can get you to Elysium. And the rumour is that on Elysium, because obviously this is where the ultra-rich live, they have access to things called med bays, which can cure almost any problem, any biological problem with humans. So Matt Damon does it. They sort of steal a ship, they go up to Elysium. In the meantime, he promises to take his childhood friend Frey. Her daughter has leukemia. He says, I'll take your kid as well, we'll get her fixed too. They go to Elysium. Obviously it's high octane, lots of fights. It's Matt Damon after all. And then as they go on the med bays, they realise they can't use them. Why? Because their genome is recognised as not being a citizen of Elysium. So it won't work for them. And so what they determine, and I'm going to ruin the film for you, I apologise. What they determine in the final third, or sort of final quarter of the film, is actually they need to change the operating system or the politics of Elysium. That's what needs to change. The final scene is Matt Damon dying, sorry, and he dies so that they can basically effectively change the operating system of Elysium. Very simple piece of code, you know, it's like a reboot when you update the OS on your computer, and the new operating system effectively recognises all human beings as citizens of Elysium. And immediately all these automated healthcare workers go, oh my god, we have to go to the planet Earth, millions of people are suffering, we have to give them access to med bays, etc, etc, etc. And that's, it's science fiction. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? Hold on a second. 2015, December 2015, we have SpaceX launching the first ever reusable first stage rocket. Sends a payload into space, comes back down, be used again and again and again. This is really viewed as the commercial backbone of a viable private space industry. 3 months earlier, a kid called Alan Kurdi, not his real name, that was a kind of dismissive Turkish name given to him. I think his name was Ayşin, something else, and you can tell me it's a Kurdish name. He was born in Syrian Kurdistan. A 3-year-old kid, probably remember this, is washed up on a beach in Bodrum. It's his dead body. Which is 3 months before we're using first stage reusable rockets, which are being launched from God knows where in I think in maybe California or in Florida. So that planet is already here. I don't think Elysium is some far off distant dystopia. It's a question of intensity. It's a question of how glaring and bleak those inequalities are. Because we already have a planet of Alan Kurdi and first stage booster rockets. We already have a planet of being able to recode our genetic information, and more than 1.5 million people every year dying because of dirty water. Actually, water that's dirtier than what you would have found in the viaducts of first century Rome. You know, there are still women who give birth at night in the dark because they don't have access to electricity. So those contradictions are already there. And for the reasons I've talked about, because of the income model that's in freefall, because of climate change, because of demographic age, and also because of automation, that's going to get worse. And so I suppose I'd want to leave you with this fundamental message, which is the sort of paths out of this are not things stay the same or fully automated luxury communism where everything gets better. I think as a society, for the reasons I've talked about, we're at something of an impasse. Things either get significantly better or things get significantly worse. That's just how I might be wrong. I could be wrong. Maybe, in 2 years' time, everything's going to get really dull again. Maybe Trump will lose to Joe Biden, Boris Johnson will be ousted by a moderate conservative, maybe. Eurozone crisis, actually that was overblown, perhaps. I doubt that. I think these are the first flashes of something much more profound. And so I'll sort of finish with the alternative world, which is not the fully automated luxury communism. What is it? It's a world which actually isn't attuned to the potential limitless ingenuity of our species, but instead reasserts the primacy of race, of gender. Let's talk about I'll finish with this, another cultural idea. The Handmaid's Tale, who's seen that? Great series. Come on. Great series. What's one really clever way, not clever, how can I put this? Coherent way of dealing with demographic ageing? Who can think of this? It could take up 30% of our GDP, that's one way of doing it. Tax the rich, or we make women do it. Plausible, isn't it? If you have an ageing society, and you have an ever large number of people over 65, over 70, over 75, one way of doing that would say, well look, we're going to seal off this part of society, we're not going to subject it to social relations of profit, we're just going to take it out of profitability, just get women to do it. That's one plausible future. That's one people love post-capitalism. They think it means socialism. It doesn't have to. That's one post-capitalist solution to a crisis of ageing. Or the green agenda, climate change. There was an ironic T-shirt which was put out there by the US far right, and it said, "Save the bees, plant more trees, shoot refugees." Right? And basically, it's very easy to see how could you synchronise a green agenda, a love of domestic nature, and a hatred of the other. It's actually very easy. Super easy. And we see this already, by the way. The first alliance between the far right and the Greens has already happened. It was in Austria last week. In Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, who are a far right party, they have a kind of social movement aligned with them, and they're called Friends of Sweden. And they just like Swedish nature. And so this is the choice we have to make and the values we sort of base ourselves around. But we also have to understand that there is really no future under the present system. So I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So we've got about 37, 38, 40 minutes for questions. Do you want to do them one at a time?
Threes? Yeah.
Okay, great. Anyone want to start?
Thanks, that was great. I've not read your book, but I get the drift of it. I wonder, have you read Anne Pettifor's Case for the Green New Deal? Her vision is of a more localised, decentralised, and less energy-intensive future. And I just wonder how we get past the kind of excessive pollution and the digital, the decarbonation divide that's developing, even with renewable technology, with this kind of fully luxurious.
Yep.
Okay. Any other? Yeah.
Given that there is no future under our current system, which is a kind of bland neoliberalism, who is the left's bigger enemy? The emergent sort of far right, or the sort of neoliberal centre which refuses to change?
Yeah.
Yeah, given all this information was available to us in the 70s,
What was available in the 70s?
all this information was available to us.
What do you
in
mean by
the 70s.
information?
So automation, the Club of Rome, the limits of growth,
Ah?
electric cars, we all knew this back in the 70s. How do we make the political leap?
How do we make the political?
Leap. So what's different now to the 70s?
Great questions, actually. Really good questions. So the first one around energy, who was the person that asked this? Yeah. I'm not a technological determinist with regards to solving the climate crisis. I don't think technology is going to do it. I think it plays a significant role. And there's a good debate to have about this. There's something called Jevons paradox. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
People are familiar with Jevons paradox? Jevons was an English economist, and he worked out that as steam engines became more efficient, we actually use more coal. Strangely, we should be using less because they're more efficient, but actually the more efficient energy production becomes, the more energy you use. And that's actually been happening ever since the late 19th century, or even since actually the first sort of steam engines came online in the early 1800s. And so one claim is, a sort of anarcho-primitivist claim, is that actually we need to get rid of capitalism, because any sort of technological solution would just means we're using more energy. The idea that we can evolve a way out of this using new technologies is implausible. I don't quite buy that. I did a talk in Sweden with somebody who thought this, and I said, look, the big difference between us is you think 12,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, humanity made a big error. And he said, yes, that's absolutely right. It should never have happened. Okay. Well, let's just say it happened. Okay, we can't do much about that now, can we? I think technology plays a big part. So, for instance, in 90 minutes, enough solar potential hits the planet's surface to meet human need over an entire calendar year. There's an immense amount of solar potential, wind potential that we don't use. And I think the sort of metaphor is, for me, humanity has been sat beneath this tree for so long, and the apple has always been in reach, but now we can finally get it with regards to renewable energy. And I'm sure that in 30, 40 years' time, you think, wow, fuck. They used to dig up stored hydrocarbons, stored solar energy, which, by the way, is what all, petrol or gas is. They used to dig it up and take it halfway across the world, and it's crazy. So I think the technology is there, I think the potential's there, but you also need to change the sort of political context within which it happens. So what do I mean by that? We can't replace every fossil fuel burning car with an electric car, right? Because it's plausible. We probably have a lithium to
I did some of the maths in the book based on a book by an economist and stuff in renewable energy. But it would be touch and go if you wanted to basically double global energy consumption and transition to electric. Potentially doable. It's certainly not post-scarcity, right? What we would need to do is we clearly need to change how we travel. You would need fewer cars, you need more trains, you need more buses. And so there's a political question, a policy question as much as a technological one. And I think a good way of thinking about this is you sometimes get these glimpses into, somebody mentioned this, we'll talk about in a second, the sort of capitalist realist subjectivity where nothing can change. And I saw Nico Rosberg, a former Formula 1 driver, and he was talking about, Uber for the 1%. And this is basically drones flying around the UAE. Right? And they're all electric. That sounds progressive. No fossil fuel emissions. But the question is, do we want these technologies like lithium-ion batteries to offer an Uber for the 1%, or do we want to say, actually, as a society, we think we should have free electric buses for everyone, right? So that's partly about the technology. It's also partly about having to change consumption habits and moving away from privatised forms of transport, which I think we probably have to do.
So if I may interrupt,
please.
It's not fully, maybe it's more, less fully automated capitalism and more kind of public luxury, a bit like George Monbiot said.
That's right.
Luxury and private kind of,
He says public. It's not in the book, but yeah, he calls it public luxury and private sufficiency.
Yeah.
Which I agree with, and I think that's all. We have to. Karl Marx was not a philosopher of equality. He was a philosopher of liberty. He was a philosopher of freedom. And actually, you don't have meaningful freedom without public luxury, right? That sounds a very strange thing to say. But you could have access to reading Goethe or playing a violin, but if in your bank balance it says £1,500 overdrawn, right, doesn't mean anything. And so, public luxury should be the basis of a sort of of a freedom. Gendered term, it was talked about by FDR. He called it a second Bill of Rights, 1944. He said, the first Bill of Rights was legal and political, and a second Bill of Rights around economic and social rights. And gendered term, but it was a very clever phrase. Necessitous men are not free men. And that's socialism. If you're necessitous, you're not free. And that's a very different conception of freedom to a Milton Friedman or to a Hayek. And so public luxury fits into that. The second question about who is the bigger enemy, the far right or the neoliberal centre. That's who is the person that asked this? It's a very difficult question, isn't it? Because I'm half Iranian, and I remember Hillary Clinton saying that she would sort of annihilate Iran if she had to, ahead of 2016. And I thought, Trump can't be worse than Clinton for Iran. That was a bit off, wasn't it? So it's a difficult question. You can end up with egg on your face. Very famously, in the mid-30s, the German Communist Party didn't think Hitler was a problem. They sort of thought the bourgeois reformists were a problem. Again, that was a bit of an oversight. So then the counter argument is, well, you need a popular front, which encompasses both the forces of the left and the centre to go up against the far right. Something like Paul Mason would say this today. And I think Paul says it because he's sort of cosplaying living in 1930s Republican Spain. But there's some truth to it as well. It's a strategy. What I would say is that liberals today are committed to an economic order which is massively intensifying all the problems they claim to not want. You claim to care about reproductive rights, gender equality, trans rights. You claim to care about all these things, great. But you're overseeing this economic system which is creating these vast regional and income inequalities to such an extent that you're getting an ever larger fragment of the population who are very angry and very reactionary. So I question the extent to which they could be part of that alliance. However, that might change over the next 5 to 10 years. Instinctively, I would say that they're both the enemy. And I think we have to understand what's happening with the middle class, the proletarianisation of the middle class. And over the last 11, 12 years, that's happened particularly with the young. Right? So they're not inheriting the class status necessarily of their parents. And people say, well, when their parents die, they don't inherit their wealth. Well, no, because of all the ageing problems I've talked about. What's going to pay for that? Asset wealth. Why was the dementia tax in 2017 such a political hot potato? The Tories didn't do it for fun. This is going to have to be addressed.
and the politics of ageing are going to lose lots of parties, lots of elections worldwide over the next couple of decades. So I think that proletarianisation of the middle class will sweep into older people as well, as the economics of elderly care really become a big, big thing. And we should try and build alliances with them. And then finally, how do you make the political leap? And who's this gentleman here? It's a great question, because you're right. A lot of what I've just said isn't particularly new. I mean, there were lots of things that were said in the 70s which weren't true. So, for instance, people said in the late 60s there was a book out about a population time bomb, which said that the planet basically couldn't feed a planet. You know, we couldn't feed the planet for 10 billion, or even 7 billion, 7.5 billion, what it is today, and we can. And the book predicted that hundreds of millions of people in South Asia would die of starvation. They didn't. Today, India is the largest. Today, India is the #1 exporter of rice, and more Indians are eating more calories than ever before. They're not perfect, but there's a major, improvement what's going on there today. We're feeding 7.5 billion people more food than ever before, and we're using about the same portion of the planet's land mass, around 35%. I'm not speculating as to how long that's sustainable, but there were some things that were wrong in the 70s, and there were some things that were right. The limits, for instance, of resource extraction, energy. I think many of the political proposals in the book aren't that different to 1970s, socialism. Sorry, that's not very interesting. People like to think they've reinvented the wheel. I'm not, I don't think we have to necessarily do that. And actually, we have to look back at public ownership of transport, housing, education, healthcare, quite simple stuff. The market. I don't think the state is best at saying what book this should be, or this pen, or this. I'm perfectly happy to have markets for these things. But should there be a market whether or not I get, a medicine? Is there competition when I get the bus? I mean, whoever got the bus and says, I'm going to wait for the next bus because there's competition. You get on the first bus. There's just a mockery of a common sense that's sort of peddled within policy elites. So no, I think in many ways we're still fighting the same fight. And you have to look at, from 1900 to 1970, we lived a huge social revolution around suffrage, around minority rights, around the welfare state, working people, life expectancy more than doubles the world. Huge shift as a species in 65, 70 years. And since then we've been in the middle of a counter-revolution, where these things are being reversed at breakneck speed. And so that's how I sort of view it, as a revolution and a counter-revolution. And neoliberalism was very much a counter-revolution, something we need to push back against.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, really good talk. I understand your hopes, but I just cannot understand your optimism. Look where we are, and look what you've talked about. Surely the biggest problem are, it comes back to this political question of convincing people, but all the crises you talk about, if you look at history, lead to very nasty politics, and that seems to me exactly where we're going. So I just cannot, I'd love to, but I just don't know where you can find any optimism in anything you say.
There was 3 hands up before, but I'm going to kind of repick Steve.
No, you want me to
Yes,
say
please,
now, right?
please, thank you.
Partly picking up from that, you say about liberals, I think liberalism has disintegrated, already began to do so even in the late 19th century. The next person we're hearing talks about social and economic liberalism. They're often politically opposed to one another. Perhaps also, you're saying you're abstract about the previous utopias don't make sense, so I don't know whether you could perhaps elaborate a bit.
What do you mean?
In
the blur?
Yeah, because, and of course that might link up to the other question about your optimism.
Do you think the way that Labour launched its Radical Green New Deal has disengaged the public's interest in climate change?
Go on, elaborate.
Because if we think about what's going on in the UK, you talked about rising rates in homelessness. We have issues with the NHS, and people want more to be invested into those kind of institutions.
Yeah.
So how can we have Labour launch a Green New Deal but not confront the Conservatives on tackling these problems that we already deal with in society?
Yeah. So the first question about optimism, I'm not optimistic. The present trend is 6 degrees warming. I've always been very, I've always been, anti-imperialist, but actually the end of American empire could be really messy in the Middle East. A complete breakdown in multiple nation states, permanent regional war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, etc. That's one thing. I'm not particularly optimistic in the slightest. What I do say is that alongside all these crises, which is kind of the first third of the book, is that we're also seeing the first glimpses of a different kind of society than the one we presently have. And that's an outgrowth really of, like I said, the human ingenuity, the problem-solving capacities, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's meat without animals, whether it's new healthcare solutions. For instance, the first human genome was sequenced 2003, I think. 2003, the first human genome was sequenced. It cost several $billion US. Today, a human genome can be sequenced for around $500. And that's falling all the time. And some people think that in about 10 to 15 years it might cost about the price of a Mars bar to sequence a human genome. So what does that mean? Okay, sort of very abstract. Okay, so one interesting application of this would be, for instance, did you know that tumours have genomes? Which is quite a strange idea, isn't it? They have their own sort of unique genetic fingerprint. And you might be able to have what are called blood biopsies for cancer, where you could detect cancer at stage 0, effectively, because of these technologies. So I'm optimistic when I hear something like that, or when I hear that we can eliminate Huntington's because of the application of CRISPR-Cas9, or having energy demands of the entire planet met through renewables. I mean, you could not be optimistic, right? That's amazing. But you're absolutely right. The present path has nothing to do with any of that. It's a much uglier place. And actually, people don't rise up when things are bad. The French Revolution was preceded by actually a comparative bumping up in living standards. The Iranian Revolution, 1979, was one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. Russian Revolution, 1917, obviously you have the First World War as the trigger, but actually, economically speaking, the sort of 5-10 years before that, were actually, in the context of the previous century, pretty good for Russia. It was actually beginning to catch up with Europe in terms of its technological base. So I'm not optimistic from any perspective in the slightest. However, as a Marxist, you have to say that humans make history, but not under conditions of their own making. So you shouldn't be too overly deterministic and say, well, this all augurs very badly. I still believe in the capacity of people to change history. Liberalism is disintegrated, yes. The idea about the new utopias. So, are you familiar with a poem by a gentleman called Teleslides?
I'm afraid not.
No? It's a 5th century poem, Greek poem, and Teleslides talks about what the old days used to be like, and he says that fresh loaves of bread are fighting with each other to get in your mouth. The fish jump out of the river and then they go and grill themselves and they put themselves on your plate. And this to me is the first kind of idea of communism, or the idea of spontaneous abundance. Right? This is the 5th century BC. Now, would somebody who's living under sort of conditions of hunter-gatherer sort of conditions, the political economy of the pre-Neolithic revolution, so humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, people with the exact same brains as us, for hundreds of thousands of years, we've only been doing agriculture for around 12,000 years, roughly. Now, before that 12,000 year period, could a human being think about what Teleslides is writing about, that utopia of Teleslides, the idea of post-scarcity, spontaneous abundance? It was implausible, but because of agriculture, because of the Neolithic revolution, he could conceptualise post-scarcity. And so that, to me, says we also need to conceptualise new utopias. And they're sort of beginning to come on the horizon. So a utopia of what? Never being sick. I don't want to live forever. People can talk about, life extension, never dying. Okay, fine, we can have that conversation. It's a certain utopia to say that anybody on the planet can talk to anybody else. That would have sounded wonderful 40 years ago, Instead, we ended up with Twitter. But we do need new utopias, because those are sort of the north stars that take society forward. And there's a huge absence of them, and which is particularly marked by the fact that the possibilities are so significant. And then finally, the Green New Deal disengaged public.
I agree. We've learned the hard way. You know, and I think Labour could win the next election. I think Keir Starmer will probably be the leader, even if it's Rebecca Long-Bailey. But they won't win as an insurgency, right? The age of insurgency is now over in Britain, I think. I could be wrong. Because people are kind of fed up. There's a kind of backlash against that. People want things to calm down a bit. And I was looking at the 1979 Tory manifesto. And obviously, Margaret Thatcher was the most radical Prime Minister of the 20th century, I think. And if you look through the Tory manifesto in 1979, barely any mention of privatisations. She talks about, I think, British Airways. She says, I want to take on the unions. And she is quite open about privatising housing stock, council housing. But other than that, not much. And I feel like the next Labour manifesto should be something like, we're going to take on the City of London. We've had enough of sort of finance taking the piss out of the rest of us. Housing, you probably have to address. But I think you probably just want 4 or 5 big areas, like you say, around healthcare, around housing, around wages, with a defined enemy, rather than what we got with this manifesto. And I just think anybody cares about green stuff. I just don't even care. But that's fine. Nobody cared about privatisations in 1979. People were like, we have to privatise the economy. That wasn't the impulse that was driving even the average Conservative activist in 1979. And yet that's what happened. And so, you know, I just think we need to maybe a little bit more restrained in what we're after. And there are certain things you can only do after winning power. You know, so people say, oh, we need, you know, the Labour Party should be like a social movement and we can offer this and this. You can't do that without the state. There's lots of things you can't do without the state. We can't change. The Tories, the right, remade public consciousness in the 1980s. They literally transformed people's idea of possibility. And that was done through brute force. The miners' strike is one example. People don't know about this often. You know, the Wapping, which is 1986. There was a political fight over what the press looked like in this country. You know, it wasn't. People say, how did Labour win? Harold Wilson won 4 general elections. You know why? Because the most read newspaper in the country was the Daily Mirror. That's why. 1945. How did Clement Attlee win with that programme? Actually, the press split both ways, Labour and Tory. Funnily enough, the Guardian said vote Liberal. Some things never change. The Daily Worker the Daily Worker, by the way, is today's Morning Star. The Daily Worker had a readership twice of the Financial Times. Right? The Daily Herald had a huge readership. The Daily Herald, by the way, was started by trade unionists. It was temporarily owned by the Trade Unions Congress, TUC. Do you know what it is today?
Sun.
It's the Sun. And so there's been a huge political fight over all this stuff. And the Tories could only do this to this extent with state power. And so we have to think similarly, you know. If we want to change sort of mass consciousness of what people are like in left behind towns, I don't think you can do that prior to taking state power.
Okay, great. Another round of questions. Bob?
Yeah, I mean, in a way this goes back to some of the things you've just been talking about, but one of the really interesting phrases you used about 10 minutes ago was going back to the 1970s and learning from what we did or didn't do then. And I'm wondering if you might just say something really quite practical about what it is that people under 35, to choose an arbitrary number today, could usefully learn from what we screwed up in the 1970s?
I don't know. I'm not best placed to answer that, but I would think about the other two. I wish I was around then, it would have been fun.
It wasn't.
Rather than 2000 as well.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Very interesting. I haven't read your book. I am a Colombian, so I do identify with some of what's happening at the moment, because we're going to the Colombian model. And I saw Elysium as well, so there's some similarities there. So my question is kind of related to what Bob said as well, and other people, and that is, I will read your book if you are actually tracing a pathway to how we can actually achieve this, because we don't have very good examples of communist states, let's face it. Do you actually have any sections on the pink tide, what they call the pink tide? I actually think it was much more radical than that in Latin America. And also how we can do this internationally, because if we can't do it, we cannot achieve this transformation with changes in just one country. It has to be regional and it has to be internationalist.
Yes. It seems as though sort of previously throughout history the most powerful people have been those who can sort of protect and police land the best. To me it seems a lot of what you're talking about, that's going to move into who can kind of police and protect information the best. How do you kind of see that moving forward, shifting sort of how power works, especially as we see sort of computer science education becoming a bigger thing? Like, is there going to be more people hacking to try and get information instead of sort of looting and robbery in that? How does that kind of, do you see that shaping the future?
Yeah, so back to the 70s, under 35s, what can young people learn? I mean, the 1970s, I think, were a very undervalued decade. I was talking at the start about GDP. The economy was in turmoil, obviously partly because of inflation, but UK GDP tripled in the 70s. It tripled. This is when we were a basket case. Home ownership was going up. Life expectancy was going up. I'm sure in 10, 20 years' time there'll be a major revision. They'll go, fuck, the 2010s were really bleak. But that's just obviously how these things work. How would I suppose what I would say to young people, they learn from the fuck-ups of the 70s. I suppose the one thing would be that you can't view parliamentary and extra-parliamentary activism as separate. Would be one. And that splitting off of the anti-nuclear movement, the green movements, that splitting off from labour-based organising. And that wasn't always the case. Some people went to Green and Common and also went to the miners' strike. I'm just offering a sort of an ideal type that probably wasn't there. But I think we have to understand that sort of we need a broader social transformation which encompasses technology, culture, politics, in the workplace, in social life, in the family, etc. So that'd be my one thing. That sort of the person as the political, but also the political as personal. It wasn't meant to be some clever thing, which is you dismiss this sphere of politics for a different one. It was about having an enhanced understanding of the political. Which, it's a lesson that's still not been fully learned. Although, actually, to be fair, I meet lots of young people and they get that instinctively. And I think it's a false binary that's often peddled about, economic relations and economic exploitation and other forms of oppression. I think people understand there's a broader thing going on there, perhaps. The Colombian model, communist states, examples. I mean, the book states quite, I hope succinctly, the editor said, please put this in. This is not about 1917. And so, a way of clarifying how we should have a sort of enhanced understanding of revolutionism in 1917. Obviously, the Russian state, by 1921, was taken over by the Bolsheviks. What's the first thing they do? They look at Taylorist production in the United States, and they say, over the last 40 years, this is how the American capitalist class has managed to get squeeze more value out of workers. This should be the last thing a socialist should think of doing, but obviously they said, well, we're an underdeveloped country, we have to do this, there's a logic there, whatever. But that was in no way communism. That was in no way saying, let's move beyond capitalism. The logic from a sort of unreformed Trotskyists would be, well, not even Trotsky, maybe Stalinists would say, both of them even. There was a level of technological industrial catch-up which was necessary, the debate, but it wasn't a society which I'm talking about. So what examples are there? Well, firstly, I think we should again talk about revise the meaning of communism. Communism, what's its legacy? People look at Honecker, East Germany, they think of the gulags, but also modern European democracy wouldn't have been possible without communists. The basis in Italy and France of constitutional democracy after the Second World War, many of the people who fought for that but also participated in it were communists. Right? The democratic project in Europe after 1945 was an anti-fascist project. People forget that. And I think it's a really important part of understanding the legacy of communism had many appalling features to it. But let's look at it in its totality. What was the primary social force that made democracy, and a republic, by the way, after 1945 in Italy? What was the primary social force? It was the Italian Communist Party. So, I'm happy to have an overall assessment there of European communism's legacy for sure. In terms of the models, that's a great question.
Cormac said, it's a great get-out for theorists and activists ever since, you know, I'm not here to write recipes for cook trips of the future. There are certain models, but in terms of, again, what I'm saying is extracting healthcare, education, housing from the sphere of profit and commodity exchange. We've done that before. You know, we had it in this country after 1945 with the National Health Service, with, you know, a massive house building programme. Now, some people say that's only possible because of empire, colonialism. That's not entirely true. It's partially true. Sweden did the same thing. So I think we can look back to the history of post-war social democracy. Now, the reason why the book's called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, not Fully Automated Luxury Social Democracy, as some of its kind of critics say it should be called, is that the pact between labour and capital after 1945 can't be asserted in the same way. And many of the factors, so there's a deal there that's done after the war which says we'll have a mixed market economy, we'll have high rates of economic growth, we'll have collaboration, a corporatist model between works and capital that will create high rates of growth, high rates of taxation, we'll get a strong public, you know, welfare state. And many people still think we can do that. We can't, because the rates of growth you get from 1945 to 1975 were completely unique. Why were they unique? Urbanisation, people going from country to city, that's a one-off factor. You don't get to do that again. In Italy, between 1945 and I think the early 70s, you're looking at 7 million people go from country to city. So what, you think Italy's not going to get 7-8% annual growth again? Women entering the labour market, that's not going to happen again. Well, in some countries. The rate of technological catch-up, a lot of the goods and services that people were buying in the 40s, 50s, cars, refrigerators, those were actually available before, but all of a sudden, you know, they were kind of just finally becoming diffuse. And then, of course, you have the technologies that come out of the Second World War, jet engine being one, global tourist industry is possible because of it. You know, I think because of a lot of those things, the complete historical one-off of using the planet's reserves of hydrocarbons, fossil fuels. So I don't think we can return to that, but I do think the idea of pulling these things out of commodity circulation is something we certainly could relearn from the post-war era. The examples are there, but how we do it probably wouldn't be the same. And then finally, about policing information. In the book I talk about one of the sort of defining features of this new mode of production, which I think is emerging, is value. Where's value coming from? The traditional factors of production were land, labour, capital. And, you know, in the early 1990s, people get very angry on the left because I sort of cite all these, you know, neoliberal Silicon Valley gurus. One's Peter Drucker, and he's actually the guy that comes up with the term post-capitalism, post-capitalist society in 1992. And he says that information is now becoming the primary factor of production. And this is then reiterated by an economist called Richard Romer, who became the chief economist at the World Bank. So this is not an outlandish idea anymore. And he says that information is the primary factor of production. And for capitalism, this is a big problem. Why? Because the source of where increasingly you get value from is also incredibly easy to replicate and distribute. Patents being the obvious example. All the value of a company is generally speaking in its patents. And yet at the same time, they're the things that you can replicate, what's called zero margin cost. I can have, thousands of copies of that patent put out, in a couple of minutes. Music is a great example with regards to zero margin cost society, Jeremy Rifkin book. You have a CD, or you have an LP, or you have a cassette. And the value is, of course, well, with a vinyl LP, it would have been on the track. But now the value is coming with this weird digital file. Where do we locate that value? And that's basically the question that surrounds Spotify's revenue model. If you can finally locate that value and trap it, then you have a profitable business, you're a profitable sector. And what's really amazing is that even though streaming has become a massive thing, we all use Spotify, even today, actually the UK music industry, in terms of how much money is being sunk into it, in real terms, including inflation, is half what it was in the late 1990s. So you're seeing it, it's called deflation. You're seeing basically a huge contraction of a whole economic market, just disappeared, not ever coming back. And so if that starts to happen in healthcare, if it starts to happen in a bunch of other sectors, that's a big problem for capitalists, because you always need new markets and new rates of return.
We've time, I think, for another round, maybe More than a right. If people's questions can be brief, can give you your responses.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
In terms of the labour movement and trade unionism, do you think trade unionism needs to acknowledge the growth in the consumer? Because I think the way in which they're modelled at the moment is still reliant upon having sort of like a set area by which industry takes place and a workforce which are there Monday to Friday, whereas nowadays you have 24-hour shops and things like that. So do we need to think about new models of undermining those relations through perhaps maybe not charging customers until the management sit around the table?
You said you could give your thoughts on universal basic income.
Ah, yeah. Yeah.
Shoot your hand up.
If nativism is going to be the balm for scarcity, what are some narratives that we can use to decouple that relationship?
Yeah. Okay, Trady. The thing you're talking about as a sort of a repertoire, a protest repertoire, happened a lot in Italy in the 1970s. You're familiar with what's called auto-reductions? Auto-reductions, yeah. So for instance, you'd have people that if there were striking workers in the cinema, rather than necessarily have a picket line, you just start letting everybody in for free. Or striking workers on the London Underground, rather than a strike, you just let everybody through the turnstiles. That still happens in France, I think, quite a lot. So no, you're absolutely right. People need to innovate with regards to how they, and that's been the case of social movements. That was the case with social movements for hundreds of years until quite recently. Constant innovation, and it's kind of stopped. And there's a book by a lady called Theda Skocpol, and she talks about something democracy. But she basically says the problem with social movements and the labour movement is that after the 1970s, they move from mobilisation to membership, which is to say that basically it became more about transactional relations with this, group of people that are representing rather than a living organic civil society organisation. And so I think that's part of the answer about why there's been a lack of innovation. UBI versus UBS. So UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a guaranteed wage. Some people say it's Marxist because all of a sudden you're decoupling a wage from work. Okay, that's one take. UBS is Universal Basic Services, which is free housing, healthcare, etc. Which one should we pursue? In the book, who's taking that answer for that? UBI? Yeah? In the book I say that I think UBS is a preferable strategy for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, there's a great quote in an article in Jacobin about UBI. A plausible UBI is unaffordable, and affordable UBI is not particularly good. It costs a hell of a lot of money. And then we can have a debate about, well, it would cost less than perhaps you think. But there was a study by Compass, and it was a big UBI, £100 billion a year plus, and it brought down child poverty by 1-2%, pension poverty by 4 or 5%. The exact numbers are in the book. But basically, for that amount of money, you could do a lot. However, could a UBI-style approach be adopted with the poorest poor, with the homeless, with people fleeing an abusive relationship, with minors? Yeah. And there's some really good studies on this. Rutger Bregman, who favours the UBI, it gives some really good empirical data for it. But I think that it's inadequate, especially with the climate challenge. We need to recalibrate our relationship to production through the UBI. Well, we need to decarbonise our economy in 20 years. So the UBS of electric public transport for everybody seems a much quicker strategy to get there. And then finally, the nativism thing. Who else is? It's a really good question. I think I've got a colleague at Navarra called Ash Sarkar, and she'll say, oh well, look, Britain's going to be a minority-majority country, which is to say white people are a minority by 2060. And she's like, good, yeah, funny. And I think, well no, this is obviously going to create huge problems, obviously. People are going to get really angry about it. And I think, that's one of the big political challenges, not even people younger than me, to actually quite openly say to people who are racist, look, Britain's going to be a minority-majority country in 40 years. Sorry. But what forms of solidarity, togetherness can we forge, collective identity can we forge, which still account for that? And so I think and that's a big question. The left tends to demur from big political questions, Brexit being the classic example. oh, we don't need to talk about Brexit because we can just talk about wages and the NHS. Maybe not. And so I think the same happened with Home Rule and Irish republicanism among some parts of the left. And so I think that I think we need to engage with that. And in this country, it's around Englishness and England. I'm not a big fan of England, by the way.